In one of the most prosperous regions of the American South stands a monument to wealth, power, and unspeakable darkness. Behind its towering columns and meticulously manicured gardens lies a secret that has been deliberately buried for nearly 2 centuries. Hundreds of graves, hundreds of human beings, not a single name recorded, not a single life acknowledged. This is the true story of the Whitmore Estate in Louisiana, a property built on forced labor, silenced tears, and lives systematically erased from official history. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about how history is written, and more importantly, how it is hidden. The evidence uncovered is irrefutable. The testimonies are haunting, and the questions we must face are urgent. How do we reckon with a past deliberately concealed? What responsibility do we bear for atrocities committed in the name of prosperity? As you watch this investigation unfold, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. This is not just history, this is a reckoning. The year is 1820. The fertile lands of southern Louisiana stretch endlessly, rich with potential for those willing to exploit every resource available. And for Thomas Whitmore III, exploitation was not just a business strategy, it was a way of life. Born into moderate wealth in Charleston, South Carolina, Whitmore had ambitions that far exceeded his inheritance. He saw opportunity in the booming cotton and sugar cane industries, and he knew exactly how to capitalize on it. Through a strategic marriage to Catherine Beaumont, daughter of one of Louisiana's wealthiest plantation families, Whitmore secured both land and social standing. By 1822, he had acquired over 3,000 acres along the Mississippi River, prime agricultural territory that would become known as the Whitmore Estate. The construction of the main mansion began that same year. Whitmore spared no expense. He commissioned architects from New Orleans to design a structure that would rival the grandest estates in the entire South. The result was breathtaking. A 3-story mansion with 22 rooms, featuring massive white columns in the Greek Revival style, wraparound galleries on both levels, and imported Italian marble throughout the interior. Crystal chandeliers shipped from France illuminated ballrooms where the elite of Louisiana society gathered. Hand-carved mahogany staircases spiraled upward with precision craftsmanship. Every detail screamed wealth, refinement, and power. But there is something the architectural records do not mention, something deliberately omitted from the official histories. The hands that built this monument to excess were not paid. They were owned. By 1825, Whitmore had purchased over 400 enslaved human beings, men, women, and children, treated not as people but as property, as tools to generate profit. The ledgers that survive tell a chilling story, each person reduced to a line item, names listed only occasionally, ages estimated, skills catalogued like livestock, purchase prices recorded with cold precision. A 20-year-old male field worker valued at $800, a 15-year-old girl with domestic training, $650, a mother and infant sold as a pair for $900, with a note that the child could be separated at age 5 for additional profit. These were not just transactions. These were human lives torn from everything they knew, forced into brutal servitude, their identities stripped away with systematic cruelty. The cotton fields stretched as far as the eye could see. Sugarcane plantations demanded back-breaking labor from sunrise to well past sunset. The work was relentless, the conditions inhumane. During harvest season, enslaved workers were driven for 18 to 20 hours a day. The heat of Louisiana summers was oppressive, often exceeding 100 degrees, with suffocating humidity. There was no shade in the fields, no breaks for water unless an overseer deemed it necessary. Collapse from exhaustion was common. Death was not infrequent. And Whitmore was not an absentee owner who could claim ignorance. He oversaw operations personally, implementing systems designed for maximum efficiency with complete disregard for human suffering. He hired overseers known for their brutality. He established quotas that were physically impossible to meet, then used failure as justification for punishment. Whippings were routine. Shackles and chains were standard tools of control. Families were separated without warning, children sold away from mothers, husbands from wives, with no concern for the devastation left behind. This was the foundation of the Whitmore fortune. This was the soil in which his empire took root. Blood, sweat, and tears absorbed into the very ground that would later hide an even darker truth. By 1830, the Whitmore estate was producing over 200,000 pounds of cotton annually, along with substantial sugarcane harvests. Thomas Whitmore had become one of the wealthiest men in Louisiana. He entertained governors, senators, and business magnates in his opulent mansion. The polite society of the South celebrated him as a visionary, a captain of industry, a pillar of the community. But behind the facade of Southern gentility, behind the carefully cultivated image of prosperity and refinement, was a system of industrial-scale human exploitation that would leave scars for generations. And those who died in service of this empire, they disappeared without a trace. To understand the true horror of the Whitmore estate, we must look beyond the mansion, beyond the fields, to the places where enslaved people were forced to exist. The slave quarters were located approximately half a mile from the main house, carefully positioned to be out of sight from the grand entrance. Out of sight, out of mind. This was deliberate. Whitmore and his guests could enjoy their luxury without being confronted by the reality that sustained it. The quarters consisted of roughly 30 wooden cabins, each measuring approximately 12 feet by 12 feet. Historical records and archaeological evidence reveal that these structures were crude, hastily built, with gaps in the walls that provided no protection from weather or insects. There were no windows, only small openings that could be covered with cloth. The floors were dirt. The roofs leaked. During winter, temperatures inside these cabins were barely warmer than outside. During summer, they became suffocating ovens. Each cabin housed anywhere from 8 to 12 people. Privacy did not exist. Dignity was a luxury they were not permitted. The daily routine was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum sustenance. Enslaved workers were awakened before dawn, usually around 4 in the morning, by the sound of a bell or the shouts of overseers. There was no time for gradual waking, no moment of peace before the day began. They were expected to be in the fields by first light. Breakfast, if it could be called that, consisted of cornmeal mush, or scraps left from the previous day. Rations were deliberately kept minimal. A weekly allowance might include a peck of cornmeal, 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork or bacon, and occasionally molasses. Fresh vegetables were rare. Meat was scarce. Malnutrition was endemic. The work itself varied by season, but was universally brutal. Planting season required clearing land, preparing soil, and sowing seeds in the relentless heat. Growing season meant constant maintenance, weeding, and irrigation in conditions that offered no respite. But harvest season was the worst. Cotton had to be picked with precision, bolls carefully separated to avoid damage that would reduce market value. Sugarcane harvesting was even more demanding. The cane had to be cut close to the ground with machetes, then processed quickly before it spoiled. The sugar mills operated around the clock during harvest, with enslaved workers assigned to grinding, boiling, and refining in dangerous conditions involving open flames and scalding liquids. Burns were common. Amputations from mill machinery were not unusual. What do you think of what you have seen so far? Does this history resonate with what you were taught? Share your perspective in the comments. We want to hear from you. and the punishments for perceived failures were savage. Whitmore maintained detailed records of infractions and consequences. Missing a daily quota resulted in whipping, with the number of lashes proportional to the shortfall. Attempting to run away, if caught, could result in branding, mutilation, or being sold to traders, heading to even harsher conditions in the Deep South. Acts of defiance or resistance were met with public punishments designed to terrorize others into submission. Families were used as leverage. A mother might be whipped in front of her children to ensure compliance. A husband might be sold away from his wife as punishment for her transgression. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of life at the Whitmore estate was the systematic erasure of identity. Enslaved people were given first names only, often changed at the whim of their owners. Family names were not recognized. Cultural practices from their African heritage were forbidden. Languages other than English were prohibited. Marriages between enslaved people had no legal standing and could be dissolved at any moment by sale or transfer. Children born into slavery were considered property from birth, their parentage noted only when relevant to their market value. This was not just physical bondage, this was cultural annihilation. And when death came, as it frequently did, there was no ceremony, no recognition, no dignity. Disease swept through the quarters regularly. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and yellow fever claimed lives by the dozens. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and untreated injuries killed many more. Childbirth was particularly dangerous, with maternal and infant mortality rates shockingly high due to lack of medical care and the expectation that women returned to field work within days of giving birth. When someone died, their body was wrapped in cloth or placed in a rough wooden box if materials were available. They were buried in designated areas beyond the quarters, in graves dug by other enslaved workers who knew they might be next. No markers, no headstones, no names carved into wood or stone, no record of who they were, where they came from, or what they endured. Archaeological excavations conducted in 2018 revealed the extent of this erasure. Over 300 graves were identified through ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation. The remains tell stories that words cannot fully capture. Evidence of severe malnutrition is visible in the bones, healed fractures that were never properly set, spinal damage consistent with carrying extremely heavy loads, arthritis in individuals who could not have been older than their 20s, and in some graves, the most heartbreaking discoveries of all, shackles and chains buried with the bodies, suggesting they died while still in restraints. Children's remains showing signs of physical abuse. Mothers buried with infants, both lost to childbirth or disease. These were human beings. Each one had a story, a family, dreams that were stolen from them. They had names that mattered, lives that had value, souls that deserved recognition. But to Thomas Whitmore and the system he represented, they were expendable, replaceable, forgettable. The records he kept focused on productivity and profit. When someone died, the entry in his ledger might note the financial loss, the need to purchase a replacement, the impact on harvest yields. But their humanity, that was never recorded. Their identities, deliberately erased. This was not an accident of history. This was intentional, and it continued for decades. April 9th, 1865. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. The Confederacy had fallen. Slavery was abolished. Freedom, at long last, was legally recognized for millions of African Americans across the South. The news reached the Whitmore estate within weeks. For the 467 people still enslaved there, the moment should have marked the beginning of a new life, but freedom, they would soon discover, came with conditions that made it almost meaningless. Thomas Whitmore III had died in 1862 before seeing the collapse of the world he had built. His son, Thomas Whitmore IV, inherited the estate, and faced a crisis. Without enslaved labor, how could the plantation continue to operate? The cotton markets were in chaos, the southern economy was devastated, banks had collapsed, currency was worthless. But Whitmore IV had land, and land meant power, even in defeat. He quickly adapted to the new reality with a system that was only marginally better than what came before: sharecropping. The newly freed people at the Whitmore estate had nowhere to go. They had no money, no resources, no land of their own. Whitmore IV made them an offer. They could stay on the estate, work the same fields they had worked as slaves, and in exchange they would receive a share of the crops they harvested. It sounded reasonable. It was anything but. The contracts were designed to ensure perpetual debt. Workers were required to rent the land they farmed, purchase seeds and tools from the estate store at inflated prices, and pay for their housing in the same cabins where they had lived as slaves. At the end of each harvest season, after all expenses were deducted, most found themselves owing more than they had earned. And debt was legally binding. If you owed money to the landowner, you could not leave. You were trapped. Thank you so much for staying with us until this point. We know this is heavy, difficult history to confront, but we promise you the most important revelations are still ahead. What we uncover next will show you just how deep this injustice runs. The law supported this system. Black codes enacted across the South immediately after the war criminalized unemployment, vagrancy, and breach of labor contracts, all terms defined loosely enough to ensnare anyone who tried to escape sharecropping arrangements. Local law enforcement, still controlled by former Confederate sympathizers, enforced these codes with enthusiasm. Former slaves who attempted to leave the Whitmore estate were arrested, fined amounts they could not pay, and then leased back to the estate as convict labor. It was slavery by another name, sanctioned by the state. And Whitmore IV continued the family tradition of erasing history. In 1867, he ordered the destruction of detailed plantation records. Ledgers that documented purchases of enslaved people were burned. Correspondence that referenced brutal punishments was destroyed. Most significantly, any records that might have identified those buried in the unmarked graves were deliberately eliminated. When asked about this years later by a journalist, Whitmore's stated reason was to protect the family's reputation during Reconstruction, to avoid being targeted by federal authorities investigating war crimes and atrocities. But the real reason was simpler and more sinister. By destroying the evidence, he ensured that the victims would remain nameless, that their suffering would be forgotten, that history could be rewritten to portray the Whitmore family as benevolent landowners rather than perpetrators of industrial-scale human exploitation. The 20th century brought new challenges, but little change in power dynamics. The Whitmore estate remained one of the largest land holdings in the region. Sharecropping gradually gave way to wage labor, but the wages were kept deliberately low. African-American workers still lived in substandard housing. They still shopped at the estate store where prices were inflated. They still found themselves in cycles of debt. Education for their children was limited to segregated schools that received a fraction of the funding given to white schools. Medical care was essentially non-existent. Political participation was blocked through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, activists attempted to organize workers at the Whitmore estate. They were met with resistance that echoed the tactics of a century earlier: economic retaliation, evictions, violence. Local law enforcement looked the other way. The Whitmore family, by then, in its 5th generation of ownership, hired private security to patrol the property and discourage outside agitators. They pressured local businesses not to serve activists. They used their political connections to ensure that voter registration drives in the area were harassed and disrupted. The system they had built was resilient, adaptable, and ruthlessly efficient at maintaining the status quo. It was not until the 1980s that the Whitmore estate began to decline. Mechanized farming reduced the need for manual labor. Global cotton markets shifted. The family's fortune, while still substantial, was no longer what it had been. In 1998, the main mansion and surrounding property were sold to a preservation trust with the intention of turning it into a historic site. The sale came with conditions. The Whitmore family insisted that the site focus on architectural significance and agricultural history, with minimal emphasis on slavery. They donated selected documents to the archives, carefully curated to present a sanitized version of the past. The unmarked graves were known to exist, but were not disclosed to the Preservation Trust. The land where hundreds were buried was designated as a restricted area, ostensibly for environmental protection. For 2 decades, tourists visited the Whitmore estate and marveled at its beauty. Docents led tours through the mansion, pointing out the chandeliers, the mahogany staircases, the imported marble. They spoke of the ingenuity required to manage such a large agricultural operation. They mentioned slavery, but in abstract terms, as an unfortunate but necessary aspect of the historical period. The people who suffered there remained invisible, their stories untold, their graves unmarked and unacknowledged. The erasure that began with Thomas Whitmore III continued into the 21st century, perpetuated by silence, by selective memory, by a desire to honor heritage without confronting the atrocities upon which it was built. But truth has a way of surfacing, and in 2018, everything changed. Dr. Rachel Montgomery had spent 15 years studying slavery in the American South. An archaeologist specializing in African American history, she had excavated sites from Virginia to Texas, uncovering evidence of lives lived in bondage and resistance. When she learned about the Whitmore estate in 2017, something immediately struck her as wrong. The official records claimed that approximately 200 enslaved people had lived on the property over the course of its operation. But her research into regional demographics, crop production levels, and comparable plantations suggested the number should have been much higher. Where were the missing people, and more importantly, where were they buried? The Preservation Trust that managed the estate was initially reluctant to authorize excavations. They cited budget constraints, concerns about disturbing the site, and uncertainty about what such a project might reveal. But Dr. Montgomery was persistent. She secured independent funding through university grants and private donors. She assembled a team of archaeologists, historians, and forensic specialists. She obtained ground-penetrating radar equipment and other non-invasive technologies that could survey the property without extensive digging. And in March of 2018, the project officially began. The first phase involved scanning the restricted area beyond the former slave quarters where oral traditions suggested burials had taken place. The radar results were stunning. The imagery revealed systematic rows of depressions in the earth, consistent with grave sites, hundreds of them, far more than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Montgomery's team cross-referenced these findings with historical maps, property surveys, and aerial photographs dating back to the 1930s. The evidence was irrefutable. This was a cemetery. A massive cemetery that had been deliberately hidden, unmarked and forgotten. Excavation began cautiously. The team worked with painstaking precision, documenting every layer of soil, every artifact, every bone fragment. What they uncovered over the following months painted a picture of suffering that was even worse than historical records suggested. The skeletal remains showed evidence of severe physical trauma. Compression fractures in spines from carrying loads far beyond human capacity, poorly healed breaks in arms and legs, indicating that injuries received no medical treatment. Dental damage consistent with malnutrition and lack of care. arthritis in joints that should only appear in much older individuals, suggesting that hard labor began in childhood and continued without respite. Children's graves were particularly heartbreaking. Over 80 graves were identified as belonging to individuals under the age of 12. Many showed signs of disease that could have been easily treated with basic medical intervention. Others showed evidence of physical abuse, fractures that could only have been caused by deliberate violence. The infant mortality rate, calculable from the number of newborn and very young remains, was over 40%. These children were born into a world that did not value their lives, and they died without ever knowing freedom, without ever being acknowledged as fully human. But the most disturbing discoveries were those that included restraints. In 17 separate graves, shackles and chains were found buried alongside the remains. These were not ceremonial objects or personal effects. These were instruments of bondage, rusted and corroded from decades in the earth. The positioning of the remains suggested that in some cases, individuals had died while still shackled. The medical examiner who analyzed these cases concluded that several deaths were likely the direct result of restraint-related injuries, strangulation from neck chains, infection from manacles that cut into flesh, inability to move or seek help during medical emergencies. As the excavations continued, Dr. Montgomery's team made another crucial discovery. Buried among the graves were fragments of pottery, tools, and other artifacts that revealed the cultural resistance of those who were enslaved. Despite prohibitions against African cultural practices, evidence suggested that burial ceremonies had been conducted in secret. Pottery shards showed patterns consistent with West African traditions. Shell arrangements and stone placements indicated ritual significance. These people, stripped of their identities in life, had fought to preserve some dignity in death. Their loved ones, themselves enslaved and powerless, had done what little they could to honor the deceased, even knowing that no marker would remain, even knowing that history would forget them. The project attracted international attention. News organizations from around the world covered the story. Scholars debated its implications for understanding the full scope of slavery's brutality, and most significantly, descendants began to come forward. Dr. Montgomery's team had extracted DNA samples from the remains, and through partnerships with genetic genealogy databases, they began the painstaking process of trying to identify individuals and locate living relatives. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of African Americans from across the country submitted DNA samples, hoping to find connections to ancestors they had never been able to trace because official records did not exist. By 2020, the team had successfully identified maternal lineages for 43 individuals buried at the site. The moment when descendants learned that their ancestors had been found, that they finally had names and stories, was profoundly emotional. For generations, these families had known only that their ancestors had been enslaved somewhere in the South. They had no documentation, no graves to visit, no way to honor their memory beyond oral traditions passed down through families. Now, for the first time, they had proof. They had remains that could be properly laid to rest. They had a place to mourn. One descendant, a woman named Patricia Johnson from Atlanta, described her experience in an interview. Her great-great-great-grandmother, a woman known in family stories only as Amelia, had been enslaved in Louisiana and had died there. But there were no records of where she was buried or even confirmation that family stories were accurate. When DNA testing confirmed that Amelia was among those buried at the Whitmore estate and that she had died in childbirth at age 19, Patricia wept. Finally, she said, her ancestor had been found. Finally, there was proof that she had existed, that her life had mattered, that she would not be forgotten. These stories multiplied. Descendants traveled from across the country to visit the site, to stand on ground where their ancestors had suffered and died. to bear witness to a history that had been deliberately hidden. The Preservation Trust, initially hesitant, began to change its approach. Tours were revised to center the experiences of enslaved people. Educational programs were developed. Plans were made for a permanent memorial, but not everyone was pleased with these developments. The Whitmore family, now scattered across the country, responded to the archaeological discoveries with a mixture of denial, defensiveness, and in some cases, outright hostility. Several family members released a public statement claiming that the emphasis on slavery was unfairly tarnishing their ancestors' legacy. They argued that Thomas Whitmore III and his descendants were products of their time, that they should not be judged by modern standards, and that the focus should remain on the architectural and agricultural significance of the estate, rather than what they called divisive political narratives. This response ignited a firestorm of debate. Historians pointed out that even by the standards of the antebellum South, the Whitmore estate was known for particularly brutal treatment of enslaved people. Contemporary accounts from the 1800s, including letters and newspaper articles, described conditions there as exceptionally harsh. The deliberate destruction of records after the Civil War was not a common practice, even among former slave owners, suggesting that the Whitmore family knew their actions would not withstand scrutiny. The decision to hide the cemetery and prevent its acknowledgement for over a century was indefensible by any standard, historical or modern. Descendants of enslaved people were even more direct in their criticism. They organized protests at the estate, demanding that the Whitmore family take responsibility for the suffering inflicted by their ancestors. They called for reparations, not just symbolic gestures, but concrete financial compensation for generations of unpaid labor and ongoing economic disadvantage that could be directly traced to slavery. They demanded that educational materials at the site explicitly name the atrocities committed there without euphemism or sanitization. And they insisted that descendants have a say in how the site is managed and how their ancestors are memorialized. The Preservation Trust found itself caught in the middle of these competing demands. On one hand, they relied on donations and support from patrons who valued historic preservation and who were sometimes uncomfortable with confrontational presentations of slavery. On the other hand, they recognized a moral obligation to tell the truth about what had happened at the Whitmore estate, and they understood that descendants had a rightful claim to be involved in decisions about the site. After months of tense negotiations, a compromise was reached. The estate would be transformed into a center for education about slavery, with a focus on the lived experiences of those who were enslaved there. The main mansion would still be preserved and displayed, but tours would explicitly connect its luxury to the forced labor that built and maintained it. The cemetery would become a memorial garden, with pathways allowing visitors to walk among the graves. Where individuals had been identified through DNA testing, markers would be placed with their names and any information that could be recovered about their lives. For those who remained unidentified, a collective memorial would honor them as human beings, whose identities were stolen but whose suffering would not be forgotten. A victims' compensation fund was established, not by the Whitmore family, who refused to contribute but through private donations and grants. The fund would support educational scholarships for descendants, fund further genealogical research, and provide resources for mental health support for those grappling with the intergenerational trauma of slavery. It was not reparations in the full sense that activists demanded, but it was a start. The transformation of the site was completed in 2023. The Memorial Garden now features 312 individual markers for identified graves and a central monument listing the estimated 188 individuals who remain unidentified. The monument bears an inscription that reads, "Here lie human beings whose names were taken, whose lives were stolen, whose suffering was hidden. We remember them. We honor them. We commit to ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated or forgotten. Educational programs at the estate now bring thousands of students each year. They learn not just about slavery as an abstract historical institution, but about specific individuals who lived and died at the Whitmore estate. They read excerpts from the few testimonies that survived. They examine artifacts recovered from the graves. They participate in difficult conversations about racism, injustice, and how societies reckon with painful pasts. Many leave deeply affected, with a more nuanced understanding of history and a commitment to confronting ongoing inequalities that have roots in slavery. But the Whitmore estate is not unique. Across the American South, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of similar sites, former plantations where enslaved people were buried in unmarked graves, properties where records were destroyed to hide evidence of atrocities, places where descendants have no way to trace their ancestry because the names of their ancestors were never recorded or were deliberately erased. Archaeologists estimate that only a small fraction of these sites have been identified, and even fewer have been excavated or memorialized. The question facing American society is what to do with this knowledge. How do we honor those who were systematically dehumanized and erased from history? What responsibility do we bear for crimes committed generations ago, but whose effects still reverberate today? How do we balance the desire to preserve beautiful architecture and celebrate heritage with the necessity of confronting the brutal realities upon which that heritage was built? These are not easy questions. They require honesty, humility, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. Some argue that focusing on slavery and its atrocities is divisive, that it opens old wounds better left healed, that it promotes guilt and resentment rather than reconciliation. But descendants of enslaved people respond that you cannot heal wounds that have never been acknowledged, that reconciliation requires truth-telling, and that justice delayed is justice denied. They point out that for centuries the official history of places like the Whitmore estate celebrated the enslavers while ignoring the enslaved. Correcting that imbalance is not divisive, it is necessary. Others argue that modern Americans should not be held responsible for the sins of their ancestors, and it is true that none of us alive today participated in slavery. But we all benefit from or are disadvantaged by systems that slavery created. Wealth accumulated through forced labor was passed down through generations, creating economic disparities that persist today. Political and social structures designed to maintain white supremacy during slavery evolved but did not disappear. The erasure of black history and culture that began on plantations continues in educational systems that teach sanitized versions of the past. We may not be responsible for creating these injustices, but we are responsible for addressing them. The story of the Whitmore estate and its unmarked tombs is ultimately a story about memory and erasure, about power and resistance, about injustice and the long fight for recognition. It reminds us that history is not neutral. It is written by those with the power to control the narrative, and for too long, that narrative excluded the voices of those who suffered most. But archaeology, genealogy, and the determination of descendants to find their ancestors are changing that. The unmarked are being marked, the unnamed are being named, the forgotten are being remembered. This is not just about the past, it is about the present and the future. It is about deciding what kind of society we want to be. One that hides uncomfortable truths, or one that faces them honestly. One that honors only the powerful, or one that recognizes the humanity of all people, even those who were denied that recognition in their own time. One that perpetuates systems of injustice, or one that actively works to dismantle them. The estate of the unmarked tombs stands as a testament to both the worst and the best of humanity. The worst in the systematic cruelty inflicted by those who valued profit over people. The best in the resilience of those who survived, who preserved what they could of their culture and dignity, and whose descendants refused to let them be forgotten. Every grave that is marked, every name that is recovered, every descendant who finds their ancestor is an act of resistance against erasure. It is a declaration that these lives mattered, that their suffering will not be minimized, and that the full truth of history must be told. Now we turn to you. How should we honor the memory of those who were deliberately forgotten? What responsibility do we have regarding this past? How do we ensure that such atrocities are never repeated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in this conversation. If this investigation has impacted you, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you do not miss our future historical investigations. And be sure to watch the next recommended video, where we reveal more buried truths of history that demand to be told. Thank you for bearing witness with us.